Hello, Biology 163. Welcome to my presentation on fluid transport in the lymphatic system. Water is important in the body as it is essential for human life. As humans, we would only be able to survive a few days without water. Various chemical reactions occur within aqueous solutions, allowing cells and vital organs of our bodies to function. Some of these processes include carrying oxygen and nutrients to all of our cells in the body, including the brain, regulating body temperature, assisting in digestion, flushing out toxins and waste, gives a sense of satiety, which means you feel full after eating, hydration of the skin, eyes, and nasal passages, and the lubrication of joints, muscles, and most internal organs. On the next slide, I will explain how body water content changes with age and development. Water content changes as humans age and develop as we contain mostly water. Through development, the water distribution within organs, muscles, fat, bones, and other tissue changes from infancy to adulthood. In fact, infants contain about 75% of their body mass in water. Adult men and women contain 50 to 60% water but can be as low as 45% as age increases. The brain and kidney have the highest proportion of water, containing 80 to 85% of their masses, and teeth have the lowest proportion of water at 8 to 10%. Next, I will explain the differences of the fluid compartments. Now I will discuss some of the differences between the intracellular fluid and the extracellular fluid. The intracellular fluid ICF lies within cells and is the principal component of the cytosol and cytoplasm. The ICF makes up about 60% of the total water in the human body, and in an average-sized adult male, the intracellular fluid accounts for about 25 liters or 7 gallons of fluid. This fluid volume tends to be very stable because the amount of water in living cells is closely regulated. If the amount of water inside a cell falls to a value that is too low, the cytosol becomes too concentrated with solutes to carry on normal cellular activities. If too much water enters a cell, the cell may burst and be destroyed. The extracellular fluid accounts for the other one-third of the body's water content. Approximately 20% of the extracellular fluid is found in plasma. Plasma travels through the body in blood vessels and transports a range of materials, including blood cells, proteins, including clotting factors and antibodies, electrolytes, nutrients, gases, and waste. Gases, nutrients, and waste materials travel between capillaries and cells through the intracellular fluid. Cells are separated from the intracellular fluid by a selectively permeable cell membrane that helps regulate the passage of materials between the intracellular fluid and the interior of the cell. The body has other water-based extracellular fluid spaces. These include the cerebrospinal fluid that bathes the brain and spinal cord, lymph, the synovial fluid in joints, the pleural fluid in the pleural cavities, the pericardial fluid in the cardiac sac, the peritoneal fluid in the peritoneal cavity, and the aqueous humor of the eye. Because these fluids are outside of cells, these fluids are also considered components of the extracellular fluid compartment. On the next slide, I will discuss how water moves through a process called osmosis. Osmosis is the movement of water through a semipermeable membrane down its concentration gradient. Water moves from an area of low concentration of a solute to an area with a higher concentration of a solute. Water moves in and out of cells and tissues as a balance of solutes ensures normal functioning, resulting in a state of equilibrium. A proper balance of solutes inside and outside of the cells is crucial for normal functioning. On the next two slides, I will talk about hydrostatic pressure and osmotic pressure, also known as oncotic pressure. Bulk flow is driven by filtration, reabsorption, and two different pressures, one being hydrostatic pressure and the other being osmotic pressure, also known as oncotic pressure. Okay, so bulk flow is the mass movement of water and fluids into and out of capillary beds relying on two pressure-given mechanisms, filtration and reabsorption, and two different pressures, hydrostatic pressure and osmotic pressure. Interstitial pressure, when low, the endothelial flaps close to prevent backflow. When increased, the spaces between the cells open up, allowing the fluid to enter. Entry of fluid into the lymphatic capillaries is also enabled by the collagen filaments that anchor the capillaries to surrounding structures. When increased, the filaments pull on the endothelial cell flaps, opening them even further to allow easy entry of the fluid. As stated previously, bulk flow is driven by these pressures listed above. Hydrostatic pressure, abbreviated HP, refers to the pressure of any fluid enclosed in a space. It is the pressure that the fluid exerts against the walls of that space. Think about hydrostatic pressure as a pressure that pushes a fluid in one direction. For example, blood hydrostatic pressure is the force exerted by the blood confined within blood vessels or heart chambers. When looking at water movement across compartments, we are interested in the hydrostatic pressure that exists within capillaries as well as the hydrostatic pressure that exists in the interstitial fluid. To distinguish between capillary and interstitial hydrostatic pressure, they can be abbreviated as CHP and IFHP. CHP and IFHP are opposing forces. While capillary hydrostatic pressure is the pressure exerted by blood against the wall of a capillary, interstitial fluid hydrostatic pressure is the pressure exerted by the interstitial fluid against the capillary wall from the opposite direction. CHP is the main force that pushes fluid out of capillaries and into the tissues. As fluid exits a capillary and moves into tissues, the hydrostatic pressure in the interstitial fluid correspondingly rises. However, CHP generally is considered higher than the IFHP because lymphatic vessels are continually absorbing excess fluid from the tissues. Thus, at the arterial end of a capillary bed, fluid generally moves out of a capillary and into the interstitial fluid. This process is called filtration, which is the movement of fluid from an area of a higher pressure in a capillary bed to an area of low pressure in the tissues. The net pressure that drives reabsorption, the movement of fluid from the interstitial fluid back into the capillaries, is called osmotic pressure, sometimes referred to as oncotic pressure. Whereas hydrostatic pressure forces fluid out of the capillary, osmotic pressure draws fluid back in. Osmotic pressure is determined by osmotic concentration gradient, that is, the difference in the solute to water concentration in the blood and tissue fluid. A region higher in solute concentration and lower in water concentration draws water across a semipermeable membrane from a region higher in water concentration and lower in solute concentration. Osmotic pressure in the blood and tissue fluid. It is important to recognize that the formed elements of blood do not contribute to osmotic concentration gradients. Rather, it is the plasma proteins that play the key role. The pressure created by the concentration of colloidal proteins in the blood is called the blood colloidal osmotic pressure, BCOP. That's its abbreviation. Its effect on capillary exchange accounts for the reabsorption of water. The plasma proteins suspended in blood cannot move across the semi-permeable capillary cell membrane, and so they remain in the plasma. As a result, blood has a higher colloidal concentration and lower water concentration than tissue fluids. It therefore attracts water. We can also say that the BCOP is higher than the interstitial fluid colloidal osmotic pressure, which is always very low because interstitial fluid contains few proteins. Thus, water is drawn from the tissue fluid back into the capillary, carrying dissolved molecules with it. This difference in colloidal osmotic pressure accounts for reabsorption. About 24 liters of fluid per day are filtered and 20.4 liters are reabsorbed. If there is no way to mobilize this excess fluid, it would remain in the interstitial space. This causes tissue swelling known as edema. The excess fluid is picked up by the capillaries of the lymphatic system. These thin-walled vessels have many valves that ensure unidirectional flow through larger lymphatic vessels that eventually drain into the subclavian veins in the neck. An important function of the lymphatic system is to return this fluid known as lymph back into the bloodstream. Causes of edema are increase in capillary hydrostatic pressure, excess retention of salt and water by the kidney, increased venous pressure, decreased atrial resistance, low plasma proteins, increased capillary permeability, and lymphatic obstruction. Then we have some symptoms. Swelling or puffiness of tissue under the skin, stretch or shiny skin over the swollen area, reduced joint motility, increased abdominal size, skin pits or dimples after pressure is applied. Here is an example of what edema can look like. Here we have the regular foot and leg. As you can see, there is no swelling or pits. Here we have an example of what edema looks like with a pitting. And here on the right, we have a real-life example of what edema can look like in patients. This is how you would calculate net filtration rate. You would use a net filtration pressure equation which subtracts the blood colloidal osmotic pressure from the capillary hydrostatic pressure as per OpenStax. This considers all the forces acting on a capillary bed at the arterial end of a bed where hydrostatic forces dominate. Filtration causes fluid to flow out. The venous end of a bed osmotic forces dominate. Reabsorption is the process where fluid flows back in. Blood and excess fluid is returned to the blood by the lymphatic system. Here is an example from the notes. Capillary hydrostatic pressure is 32 mmHg. Interstitial fluid hydrostatic pressure is 1 mmHg. Capillary osmotic pressure is 25 mmHg, and interstitial fluid osmotic pressure is 2 mmHg. Calculate the net filtration pressure. Which way will water move? You can think about it for a few seconds, and then I will say the answer. The answer is plus 8 mmHg. Fluid will move out of the capillary. Describe the process of recovering fluid at a capillary bed. The net pressure that drives reabsorption, the movement of fluid from the interstitial fluid back into the capillaries, is called osmotic pressure or oncotic pressure. Hydrostatic pressure forces fluid out of the capillary, whereas osmotic pressure draws fluid back in. And then you can see the capillary bed in that on the right, and those pressures. Describe the structure and functions of the lymphatic tissue. Lymph fluid, vessels, ducts, and organs. The lymphatic system contains vessels, cells, and other organs that carry excess fluids to the bloodstream and filter out pathogens from the blood. Lymph fluid, interstitial fluid that has entered the lymphatic system. It drains the excess fluid and empties it back into bloodstream via a series of vessels, trunks, and ducts. Lymphatic vessels transport the cells of the immune system and begin when lymphatic capillaries close at one end. Lymph nodes are staging areas for the development of critical immune responses found in the groin, armpit, neck, chest, abdomen, and humans have about 500 to 600 of them. And lymphatic capillaries formed by one cell thick layer of endothelial cells. Low pressure interstitial pressure, endothelial flaps close. Increased interstitial pressure, space between cells opens and allows fluid to enter. Here we have a diagram of the lymphatic system. You can see the different organs and glands distributed throughout this diagram. We have the adenoids, tonsils, thymus gland, the ducts, thoracic ducts, axillary lymph nodes, spleen, pairs, patches, nidal lymph nodes, appendix, leg lymph nodes, and bone marrow. You can take a look at that to see where they exactly are. Describe the flow of lymph back to the heart. There are one-way valves in lymphatic vessels to keep the lymph moving toward the heart. Lymph flows from the lymphatic capillaries through lymphatic vessels and then is returned to the circulatory system via the lymphatic ducts located at the junction of the jugular and subclavian veins and necks. The right lymphatic duct drains the right arm, thorax, and head. And here is a diagram showing that. Lastly, this is my works cited. I use some sources from OpenStax, Verywell Health, Department of Biology using the notes, and Lumen Learning and OpenStax. Anyways, I hope you enjoyed this presentation and it gives you a little insight on what happens throughout the lymphatic system, and hope it helps you on your exam coming up soon. Thanks for listening.